Thank you for joining us for the online artist talk as part of our current exhibition, Aurora's Asleep in Violet Light, multi-sensory video installation by Ilana Bartow and Bryce Krinsky at Surrey Art Gallery. The gallery is situated on the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territories of the Salish peoples, including the Katzie, Kwantlen, and Semiahmoo nations. My name is Zoe. I'm the curatorial assistant at the gallery. My pronouns are she, her. I'm an immigrant currently based on the unceded and occupied territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, also known as Vancouver. My colleague Reese, assistant curator, will also be supporting the event tonight. He will be monitoring the chat box, so if you have any questions, please do share in there. Today's event is being recorded and will be shared on our YouTube channel, so please feel free to turn your camera on or off as you feel comfortable. The live captioning function can be turned on at the bottom of the screen by clicking on the CC button and selecting Show Subtitle. It is auto-generated, so might not be accurate at all times, so feel free to raise any questions in the chat box if further clarification is needed. Today's artist talk will begin with a screening of Aurora's Asleep in Violet Light, which is around 14 minutes. After that, Ilana and Bryce will give us an artist talk on their research and filming process behind the project. Following the talk, Lori Weinheimer from BC Native Bees Society will give us an introduction on the wild bee species here in the Lower Mainland area and the crucial role that they play in maintaining a healthy environment. I will now begin the video. And that was Aurora's Asleep in Violet Light. For those of you that can't make it to the gallery, we are happy to send a scratch and sniff card to you through mail. You can email us your mailing address and we will get a copy out to you. And tonight, we're so glad to have Ilana and Bryce joining us to share this amazing work came to fruition. I would like to first introduce Ilana and Bryce. Ilana Bartow is an artist based in Treaty 7 territory in Mohkinstsis, also known as Calgary. They come from a long line of water witches, also as dowsing. Their site-responsive artworks explore divination, walking, drawing, and dreaming as ways of understanding across places, species, and bodies. Through collaborative and individual works, Bartow examines our relationships with the earth, the elements, and what are colonially known as natural resources. Ilana's practice spans across drawing, moving image, performance art, sculpture, socially engaged art, public art, installation, and curatorial work. Their work has been exhibited in many major galleries and festivals, both in Canada and internationally. Bryce Krinsky was born in Winnipeg and currently based in Mohkinstsis of Treaty 7 territory. First studying to become a chef, then changing course to journalism, Bryce found his way to art through photography as medium of expression and spent 10 years making images for national magazines and news outlets before shifting to a fine art practice. As an artist and filmmaker, his practice merges the concern with how food is grown, made, shared, and what stories are told about this process, with a love of discarded scenes, overlooked histories, themes of humor, memory, healing, wayfinding, and being able to laugh in the face of personal misfortune. Bryce's work make uses of photography, video, new archival found images, digital manipulation, historical food narratives, found objects, and a desire to see in new ways, with a goal of establishing new stories out of this process. His work is part of Alberta Foundation for the Arts and Bow Valley College collections. Welcome, Ilana and Bryce.
Thank you. Hi, everyone.
Nice to see everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming. Thank you to Zoe and Reese and to Lori for being here and being part of this event. We're excited. So I will share my screen. Working okay for everyone? Yeah, so I think we wanted to just share a little bit about our process today. We have worked together collaboratively on a few films at this point, but this was our first film that was, I guess, truly collaborative in the sense that Bryce has a lot of experience in photography and so he's worked on a number of films I've directed in the past, and this was our first truly collaborative piece where the whole concept was both of us working on it together, and each of us kind of bringing in our own skill sets to develop this work. And I should say the Alberta Foundation for the Arts gave us a grant that was really essential in supporting this work. And I also teach at Alberta University of the Arts and received some from them as well to do some of the research for this film. So I just wanted to share, we each wanted to share a couple of pieces that kind of gives context to our practices and sort of how we got interested in the scent component. So not everyone might have had that actually watching the film, but you'll notice there were numbers that came on the screen and the film paused. So you might have been a bit confused if you didn't know, but there's actually a scratch and sniff card that we made. So we got really interested in this concept of olfactory art and working with video. And there's a John Waters film called Polyester. So that was a big inspiration for us wanting to integrate scratch and sniff with video. So the idea is that they're each numbered on the card, and we'll show a slide of that later and talk about that whole process and how we developed the scent component for the film, because it was a big learning curve for us. But this is an old piece of mine called Essential Oils for Alberta. And a lot of my work is very site specific. And I think a lot about the context of living in Alberta. And I'm not originally from Alberta. I moved here about, I guess, 9 years ago now. And since I moved here, a lot of my work has really become interested in looking at issues around oil and gas extraction, and also our health and remediation practices. I'm really interested in how we think about healing not only our own bodies, but how we think about ourselves as integrated into the places that where we live and issues in ecology. So this series was supported by the City of Calgary Public Art Program, and I had a residency through them. So I was one of 3 artists active, and it was a 12-week community-based research residency. So I got to have a studio space, and my proposal was really around the process called enfleurage, which some people might be familiar with. It's really an ancient practice of extracting essential oils from botanical materials. So it dates back to Egyptian times, and then the French were really involved, and it's still used in perfume practices today, but it's very time consuming. So it's not very common anymore. But I really wanted to explore it through this residency and use the residency as an opportunity to try this process and to explore scent in relation to place, and specifically in relation to communities where the residency was kind of based. So it was in downtown Calgary and West Hillhurst, which is kind of where this studio is situated. And a lot of my work is very community engaged, and I'm really interested in kind of process-based work and exploring the process and seeing where it leads me. So I wanted to use this residency also as a way to kind of open up my process and bring people into the studio, actually invite them to contribute materials to this process, and people could come and do studio visits with me. I ran a number of workshops, and I also met one of my long-term collaborators, Latifa Peltier Ahmed, and she's a botanist and an herbalist, and she co-owns a native plant business here in Mohkinstsis called ALCLA Native Plants. She's very knowledgeable about just native plants and seed and how to grow them. So that was a lot of research was really hands-on, and actually like learning how to grow plants and learning about native species and plants that are known as weeds. So I worked with her, and I also worked with an aromatherapist to learn a little bit more about scent, and run a number of workshops that were free and open to the public so that people could come and learn this process along with me. So this is the documentation that you see. So I experimented with different types of plants and other materials that I collected to see if I could extract essential oils and how strong the scents were. So this was really my first time as an artist working with scent in my artistic practice. And I often use photography as a medium to really document my process, and these photographs kind of become a record of the work, and so they're part of the work itself. Is this of photographs, but then I really think of my practice in an expansive way. So I see the workshops also as part of this work, and a lot of the research around it being documented in various ways. So Deanna Russell, who's a local aromatherapist, came and ran a workshop, and we gave participants materials, and we invited them to bring different types of flowers and to experiment with the enfleurage process. But like I said, it's very time consuming, so it can take months to actually create an essential oil. So that was part of my learning process. So essentially you use animal fat, or you could use a vegetable oil, and you would spread it onto a glass surface. And so the white that you see behind the flowers in these two photographs is actually animal fat. And so you would place the material that you're trying to extract the essential oils from on top of the fat, and you would leave it for this is part of the tricky part, depending on sort of the climate you're working in and the freshness of the materials. You want to remove them very quickly before a mold forms, and so the fat over time absorbs the scent. So there's different kind of recipes for doing this process. But again, it's very specific to the place and the weather and all kinds of conditions. So it's a really, it's a very dedicated process, and I had a lot of failure with the process and trial and error. So for me, it wasn't necessarily about having a successful essential oil extraction, although I did have a few of them, but it was really about learning about the process itself. So this is another one of the workshops that Latifa and I ran collaboratively through the residency. And this one was called Weed Notice. And so a lot of my research began to kind of focus on plants that are considered weeds and how we think about them in urban spaces and their histories. And a lot of these weeds are native plants to Mohkinstsis or Treaty 7 territory. A lot of them have been brought over through settler colonization. And that's a big part of my research as well, as looking at my own history as someone of Danish and German and Scottish and English ancestry, and sort of looking at my own histories and impacts on the lands in which I live, and thinking about how we talk about these histories and learn about those histories through artworks and through the different ways that we learn. So we opened up and created a series of public walks where we would bring people through downtown, and we would talk about weeds and the histories of plants and their edible and medicinal properties. And we would also introduce people to native plants as well and talk about the histories. This is Bryce's work.
That was good. Hi, everyone. So I guess our work has crossed over with photo before and site specificity in ways that are always like not tied to food or extractive resource. Pulling in this, I've been in other careers out of the art world. I've done a lot of cooking. Been a chef. I've worked with flavor and flavor developments a lot to create different products. So that is where scent's always been an interesting component to me, because it's so important in taste. and development of flavors, even in just thinking about food. So how food is produced and how family traditionally was involved with producing food as settlers as well, because I have a Mennonite and a Polish settler background in Canada. So part of my art practice has dissected me trying to learn about that, being excluded a long time ago from my family, and try to unearth those histories and those secrets that are buried into the food language and senses that aren't always primary in our culture. Also, my photographic practice has looked at archival images that have to do with things like religion and other systems that are built in and around food and culture. Yeah, this piece specifically, that was all kind of like a little bit of the background behind that, but this was also quite a performance, but I cooked my grandmother's recipe in the gallery and then served it along with the sauce that went with it. So I made handmade these pierogies, as we would generally call it, and kept walking down to the gallery and serving them. So you had this smell that filled the room as well, of this like bacon fat gravy that they'd be traditionally eaten with. And not like everyone, you know, people aren't into gluten or whatever, but enough people ate them that there was this also kind of grandma-like meal aspect to the event, besides these photos of family history and traditions that I had broken with and now been unearthing to find other meanings in them. So that kind of explains the food and photography aspect of that. But kind of through working through film with Alana and spending a lot of time in different sites in Southern Alberta, working on film projects that have to do with mine, my own commercial photography in the past had me go to shoot for magazines, let's say, in a lot of areas that there was mining things going on. So just driving through Southern Alberta, we noticed things. And this place caught our eye going back and forth between Lethbridge, and went back to shoot it. It looks like an immense salt flat for anything that you see around here. And a lot of people, when they see these kinds of images, they think something like from Utah, or, you know, not from Southern Alberta. But it has as much to do with the geological history of Alberta as it does to with water practices that have to do with farming and industrial agriculture and the control and use of water. So this used to be, well, it was, of course, prairie grassland to begin with somewhat. 60 million years ago, it was an inland sea. And eventually it was farmland that was tilled so much that, and the water was used up in the area so much that it started to go super dry. And every season it wasn't quite dry, that it looks like a desert, and it's crunchy and salty, and it is a salt flat. And these plants, there's two different colors of these plants on the shore. There's green ones and red ones, and they kind of look like coral or something popping out of a seabed. They're really fascinating. But when I showed up there had been these angels and kind of like tarot cards scattered everywhere on the shore. That was interesting to shoot, just from a kind of a magical happenstance, site-specific, wonderful thing that was being gifted from the universe. But at the same time, once I looked into what these plants were, through the help of our friend Latifa and the internet, there's something that's used as a food source around the world, and pickled and dried and used as plant salts. So that was another part of the project. It's not on this slide, but turning those things into is considered something like a chef-like product, to talk about the meaning of what happens after these spaces, even after they're considered totally broken, and what can come out of that, and how we move forward into a future with food insecurity everywhere that everyone's dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're getting into kind of like some stuff about the making of the film, and testing out scents for the scent cards, because before we decided that we needed something that was robust enough, kind of a professional printer to make these cards and stickers to be able to have a longer shelf life, we did a ton of DIY testing to kind of figure out if it would be possible to do it and what that was going to be, what the delivery method was going to be. So we tested out dozens of different glues and natural, not natural. I did a bunch of workshops at the Institute for Art and Olfaction in Los Angeles about scent designing and designing scent for confined spaces and opt-in experiences. And so we were looking for something that was kind of non-toxic. Anyways, that whole thing boiled into the card, which because scratch and stiff Snickers, stickers with all these different substances. Some of them kind of worked, but they wouldn't last for a couple days. After they got too dry, they weren't made because microencapsulation is the process that allows these stickers to these little bubbles that do not give away too much of the scent over a long period of time until you break them open by scratching them.
Yeah, so we worked with a printer in the US called Printascent, and that's actually who John Waters worked with as well to produce the scratch and sniff cards for Esther. And so this is what the scratch and sniff card looks like if you weren't able to get one for the screening. So each scent is numbered. So number 1 is natural gas scent. And then number 2 is yarrow, which is a native plant to Treaty 7 territory and what is now known as Alberta. And it has kind of more of a herbaceous, kind of almost like a piney scent to it. And that was probably the most complex scent for us to recreate. Number 3 is manure. And that's when you see the cows in the video. And then number 4 was sage. So the prairie sage. And then number 5 is a wild rose. And so it's kind of part of the narrative of the story that unfolds of this solitary bee who's searching for a wild rose in the landscape. So how we came up with the scents was part of the filming process and just us ourselves going out into the landscape and just head here. I noticed the video was lagging a bit. I don't know how choppy it was. I think it's just online on Zoom, but if you see the film in person, it's much smoother. And here you see Bryce, he's what thing called?
It's a Steadicam,
right? So we used a Steadicam, and this image is of me, and I created the little bee parts that you see in the video because I really wanted to offer this the bee's point of view. And so
something that was really important to us through the whole conceptual phase of this was decentering the human perception, not only with smell component because of how strong smell goes beyond language for us and in time, but also being the first person through the bee's eyes.
So I created basically the kind of legs of the bee and a really long tongue. It was a long tongued bee
pollen sacs on it,
with pollen sacs, and we started doing research about native bees to Alberta, which I hadn't really thought too much about before. Lori's going to talk more about native bee species, so I won't get too much into it, but we learned that there were 322 different species of native bees to Alberta, and that honeybees are essentially an invasive species. And so we started thinking about, wow, there's just such biodiversity that, this idea that we think of a bee as the honeybee, and we don't even really I guess, understand, just the diversity of bees. So a lot of bees in Alberta, up to 70%, I believe, are solitary bees. So they live alone, and a lot of them are ground nesting bees. So there's a minute in our video where we kind of see the bee from the bee's point of view. It's circling the ground, and it's kind of looking for this hole in the ground, which is its home. It actually says here's home. So when I was doing research, I was looking at native bee species, and all that to say are bees necessarily one specific species, but it's sort of meant to be kind of this, like, there's a bit of humor in the work obviously, and like I'm really interested in using humor as a strategy to disrupt the viewer a little bit in my work in order to engage in difficult conversations about resource extraction or our relationships with the environment, our relationship to the bees, who, you know, we are intertwined with and rely on in many ways. And so, yeah, so this is just an
I
image.
feel like when we wrote the dialogue too, we kind of wrote it serious the first few times, and it just didn't. It
Yeah.
wasn't the same film, didn't have the same impact. So we started to get more playful with it. Also because it is kind of a lot like a dream sequence, and didn't have as many. It's a little bit, there's an absurdity that way, so it didn't have as many
Yeah.
roles.
So we shot the film with a camera, a digital camera converted to shoot in the UV spectrum. So that's why a lot of the images are bathed in this violet light. And so we were really interested in that's the spectrum that bees actually see in. So we wanted to try and approximate that for the viewer.
Yeah, and we had a part of that spectrum because we had the sensor that was converted for the camera, and then we had filters that went on the lenses that are used in astrophotography to capture certain wavelength parts of the wavelength in the UV spectrum. And then we also ended up adding, because there's not much UV in the landscape to begin with, especially on cloudy days or whatever. And then we were filming during the biggest parts of the fires in the beginning of the pandemic. So kind of cut down on a lot of ability for light to be available, cut down the size of our day. And so we also added other sources of UV to pad out the scene sometimes. So you see kind of like in this slide here, what kind of the sensor native with the without the filter looks like. And that was kind of our natural environment for bee when not looking deeply into the flower. And the flowers are when you have the astrophotography extra UV layer on top of the sensor.
Yeah, so like out those violet purple hues. And yeah, and that's, we started kind of building the narrative around like our own experiences in the environment and what we were smelling and what we were experiencing. So we were shooting in the summer. There was a lot of smoke, like heavy in the air. So like Bryce said, like it really impacted just our ability to shoot because there's so much smoke that the UV is just like not even getting to the ground. So we had to kind of use different flashlights. So we were working with a lot of different kind of lo-fi equipment. It's just the two of us shooting the film as well. We didn't really have a crew or anything. So, but it was so fascinating because in using that technology, a lot of the flowers become kind of unrecognizable. Which I was really interested in, this kind of otherworldly feeling, and you were too. This is a sunflower, and so through the UV spectrum, it still looks yellow, but you can see this kind of almost like an inner ring of darker coloration, and you can see it here too. This is a closer shot, so we were using that additional filter. But you can't see that, I guess, with the naked human eye is what I'm trying to say. But bees can see these patterns. Often they look like flowers. So they're pointing to the center of the flower. So it's almost like, you know, here's where you get the pollen and here's the nectar.
It also kind of an interesting challenge just from filmmaking perspective, because a lot of times when we're building a scene, they're really tiny scenes on a macro lens. We're communicating with each other, maybe where the animation of the bee is, maybe where the lights are, and we can't really see what we're talking about. So there's a lot of redoing things and having to figure out how to communicate properly in that process about just where stuff is.
Yeah. And so throughout the filming, we were trying to, I guess, think about things from the bee's perspective, and I think in part shooting through camera and like having these long days of trying to capture flowers and in the light, and me working with the little bee parts to animate the bee. And we also put antennas on the camera. We make a little mesh so that when the bee's flying around, you kind of see the shadow of the antennae. Yeah, it was just like a lot of experimentation, and I really liked the kind of awkwardness and kind of campiness of the bee, like tongue and birds, and it
There
was,
was a lot of learning how to move like other
Yeah.
things, which is also decentering in the making.
Mhm.
You know, like the walking with camera to get steady in the path that the bee is flying was
Yeah.
like the way it took like 3 weeks to learn how to walk like that properly, to
Yeah.
not get totally crap footage.
Yeah.
Moving like the bee inside of the frame without being able to see what was going on.
Yeah, and the first few days of shooting, it was very windy. It's very windy on the prairie, and these flowers are incredibly resilient. Like they can take hail, they can take wind. So often a lot of um, flowers and just plant life that is native to prairie grasslands and the prairie landscape, it's quite small, and so it's overlooked. Like people don't appreciate the beauty of a wild rose in the same way that they appreciate the beauty of like cultivated rose that isn't even really natural, and it's also really conforming to a lot of like Western standards of aesthetic beauty. So we were interested in really learning about the prairie plants, and actually like grew a lot of these plants and have continued to grow them, and learn about how to care for them. So that was part of the process as well. Because we were thinking a lot about just how these plants have been eradicated from the landscape. Like prairie grasslands are very endangered. There's not a lot of them left. So even to go shoot this film,
And in the beginning, like what Alana was mentioning was when we went out, it was really windy.
yeah,
The first day we went out. And so all the footage of these tiny little, mostly tiny little flowers was just like basically whipping back and forth so
Yeah.
fast. And we thought this was going to be kind of impossible to do.
yeah, it looked like a heavy metal
Heavy
video.
metal,
Something
kind
of
of.
these flowers like moving very rapidly. When when you're standing there, it just like looked like the wind was blowing them kind of almost subtly, but then once you had that close-up footage, it was very intense, and you had this whole different perspective. But yeah, we shot a lot of the footage in the Milk River area in southern Alberta. And we went to what was the name of the place we went to?
The grazing land.
Yeah, it's communal grazing land, so it's publicly accessible land, and farmers can graze their cattle there. But essentially, those cattle are replacing the role that the buffalo would have had in grazing the prairie landscape, and they're keystone species in this landscape.
There's also oil and gas development on it,
Yeah.
and it's recreational use.
Yeah, so we started thinking about, okay, well, if we're going to be talking about landscape in this piece, like what is the bee encountering as it's searching for these native plants, which are very rare and difficult to find now. This is actually fireweed, which a lot of people probably wouldn't recognize it. It's well, it grows after fires, and it's kind of a bright pink. You're seeing it through the
In a big cluster that's hand size.
Yeah, quite tall plants. They're very beautiful. I know that they grow in British Columbia as well, and I think across Canada in various areas. So this is a close up, and yeah, you can. It's almost like hard to tell plants are what, because you're seeing them in the UV spectrum film. These are some of the cattle that were using area where we were filming, and we thought we had to include them.
Also as a scent. So like in choosing, I just want to go back to like choosing the scent
Oh,
in a
yeah,
way
yeah.
that a lot of people have asked us, why did you choose those 5 scents? And a lot of it, like you said, came down to like spending time on the land making this film, and realizing that the bee is experiencing these things that we're experiencing. And then also in scent development, there's like certain things that are going to work with certain applications, and some of them that didn't work so well. So we had other things on the list, but they just couldn't be accomplished for scratch and sniff, basically.
Yeah, it was yeah, I think like part of you know, the playful humor in this, like when you see, are you salivating? And we're looking at these cattle, humans, you're smelling the manure. So we really wanted to play with this idea of like attraction and repulsion in the work, and how that would impact the viewer's experience.
And how it goes to like how our fate is tied to all these other we consider livestock animals, because most people think about honeybees, but we're trying to like expand the conversation, and still it's all our fate is tied together.
Yeah, definitely. These are just some images where it was first shown at the Art Gallery of Alberta, Edmonton. And when it was shown there, it was in a single gallery space, so the projection was quite large, and so it was a very immersive experience. But we've shown it a number of times in different ways. You can see people kind of viewing it together. This is the work at Vivian Art Gallery in Kansas, Calgary, and so we've shown it on smaller screens. And I think with a lot of my work anyways, I'm always interested in like how it can reach different audiences in different venues in different ways. So we really like the idea of having it at Art Gallery in a space that is kind of outside the gallery where people can access it, that maybe may or may not go
Don't
into
typically go to a gallery.
yeah, maybe like not typically come into it. And we also have worked with different stills from the video, and these are photographs that essentially are video stills that were printed and mounted on aluminum. And then there's a lot of footage that didn't make it into the film that was very compelling and beautiful and interesting, but it just didn't really fit within the narrative that we built. But these are some thistles, and there were ants pollinating. Sometimes these other insects would come into the shots, and you can see some of the other insects in the film, you know, that the bee would have encountered. And then this is another piece that I guess we just wanted to talk about because, well, we know that Lori has a art practice as well, and that this concept of telling the bees, or this kind of history and idea is something that we were also interested in. So we made this other work, and it's called Texting the Bees. And so with this piece, we collaborated with Lowell Smith and Stefan Clement, and basically worked with them to build this interactive artwork, which is a texting piece. So it's interactive and it's an LED sign. And we started kind of researching different traditions around how people relate to bees. And we were looking at European traditions. Telling the bees is an old tradition in some European countries, and honeybee keepers would tell the bees of tragic news or important events in their lives. And so it was thought that if people not communicate this information to the bees would leave, you know, and then their crops and their gardens would not be pollinated. So I just thought, wow, this is like an amazing tradition and a kind of ritual that, you know, really speaks about our relationship building with bees. Even though it's with honeybees, like, how do I think about this tradition today and now? Or like, how do we reinterpret it in an artwork? So we got this idea of texting the bees. So there's a phone number, and basically people can text the bees important information in their lives. And so when the piece is set up in conjunction with this film, I think it kind of you know, asks these questions about what is our relationship with these today. What's the important information that you want to text to the bees? Yeah, and if there's anything you want to say about that.
Yeah, and people, just on the technical side of it, people can keep texting it after if they want to, and the messages keep going into the database, and it keeps building this kind of story and holding it for them. And it could become something else in the future, we don't know, but it's just been interesting to see it at different iterations of this and see people react. And kind of after absorbing a film and having this message, giving a message back, and kind of having this full circle with their experience.
Yeah, and it's also a way for us to continue to think about like how we want to work with language
Yeah.
in this series or this piece. So this is just a short video sharing some of the messages that people have sent. And so a lot of the messages are quite personal,
Deeply personal.
really deeply personal. They're talking about major events in people's lives, marriages, deaths, breakups, you know, transitional kind of times and periods, the birth of children, or yeah, a lot of yeah, deeply personal things, I guess. I'll just say, and fears too. People text a lot of fears, kind of. Also, people text messages of thanks to the bees,
Gratitude.
and gratitude. And so really, I think this piece, as well as our film, is bringing up the conversation around how our fate is tied to the bees, and that many to bees, including obviously habitat loss and monoculture crops, neonicotinoids, like chemicals that we put into the environment that impact bees and kill them, climate change and pathogens. So yeah, I guess that's all I'll say about that. But I think another big part of the film that we haven't touched on is kind of the thinking about the unconscious and the dreamlike quality of it. And so this idea that, are you watching, are you really seeing something from the bee's perspective, or are you dreaming as a bee, or are you seeing the bee relive its last moments of its life?
Which came out of a poem, kind of.
Yeah, and that was kind of inspired by E.E. Cummings' poem. There's a poem that he wrote about, it's called Unbeamo, and kind of the way that he disrupts language structures and the conventions of language was interesting to us. And so I think we kind of took that, I guess, approach and to the way we wanted to think about filmmaking to some degree.
Yeah, it's good.
In the film. Yeah. Just let that go.
Thanks so much, Alana and Bryce. That was it really is just so much detail and care that went into this work. I think every time I've seen this work quite a few times now, but every time there seem to be new details emerging. And I noticed the shadows, but I didn't really realize that was the shadow casted by the antenna. So that was another fun fact that I got to learn today through the talk. Yeah. Okay. I think, yeah, now I would introduce Lori. Lori is joining us from the BC Native Bee Society. And Lori is also known as the Madame Bee Speaker. Sorry, just. And yeah, Lori's a Vancouver performance-based interdisciplinary artist and educator. She is the author of a best-selling book called Victory Gardens for Bees, a DIY guide for saving the bees. She's passionate about creating habitat and conserving native habitat for native bees, as well as reworking our food systems to be more sustainable. Welcome, Lori.
Thanks, Zoe. It's so much fun to be here. Thanks, Alana and Bryce. I love your work. It just is so inspiring and moving. I'm all over it. I love it. I'm really excited to talk to you about BC native bees, and I'll also talk a little bit about some Alberta bees, because I'm originally from Treaty 6 territory in Saskatchewan, and my mom lives in Alberta, so I get to see some Alberta bees from time to time. And I'm sad because it's the end of the above ground bee season. A lot of the bees are now going below the ground. They're below the ground. They're waiting for next year. or they're in stems, or they're packing it in and they're hibernating for next year. And so just a few days ago, I saw a leafcutter bee, and I think maybe that might be the last solitary bee I'll see for the year. I don't know, but at this time of the year, it's like, is this the last bee I'm seeing? And so I put a leafcutter bee here with its lovely hairy belly to talk about that. I gratefully acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, Squamish, Stolo, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations, in here what is called Vancouver. So I wanted to, as part of my land acknowledgement, talk about the connection of native bees to native plants. And in some cases, the relationship to the bee, between the bee and the plant, is very specific. There's specialist bees. And in some cases, bees have evolved to be more generalists, so they can go to a number of different plants. And these are different, there's a spectrum of a kind of breadth of what kind of plants that bees forage on. And this spring, I was really lucky to go with my partner, Darren, to Pachina Bay. And he spotted this enclosure, which had a protected rare plant called the silky beach pea. And I was just so excited to see this plant. I'd never seen it before, but I'd heard about it. And you can see here, even in the flower, that there's these veins with these patterns on them. And I'm certain that under ultraviolet light, the bee would see these patterns. And of course, they point to the center of the flower where the resources are, either pollen or nectar, or both pollen and nectar. And so this is what it looked like on the beach. And there's, it's all set up there, and there's some signage so that people don't step on it. Beaches are very sensitive habitat. As you know, they're used for recreation. And so dogs and people and kids, and they're going to be all over it. And so it was really interesting to see this set up. This is an Indigenous owned campground in Pachina Bay. And so this is Lathyrus littoralis, the silky beach pea. And these signs are showing that you shouldn't go there. And there's a picture of a bumblebee on the silky beach pea. But there's actually a specialist bee that is particularly evolved for pollinating these plants, which is the Pacific Dune digger bee. And I had seen one on Galiano Island, actually in a camas flower, which is another beautiful native plant that we have in our coastal ecosystems. And you can see this bee has a very long tongue. And they've got these beautiful big blue eyes, and they're very fast, and they zip around, and they hover over the flowers. And they drink the nectar and collect the pollen on their back legs. They have a lot of hair on their back legs, which we call pollen pants. And we have a little trick where we catch the bee. My friend Sarah Johnson caught it and put it in a little cooler for a few minutes. We slow it down so we can actually take a macro shot of it. And you can see the pollen from the camas on the back legs of this bee. And you can see how just gorgeous this bee is. I mean, can you not fall in love with this bee? It's so beautiful. Habropoda miserabilis. I don't know who named it. I don't know why they thought it was a miserable bee, but it has a very interesting name. And then Bonnie, who's my friend and colleague who helps to teach the Master Melittologist program here in BC, she actually found a nesting site, which is an aggregate of many, many, many of these solitary bees together nesting in the same place because the conditions are just right. And she posted it on iNaturalist. So I had seen this and thought it was quite fascinating. And you can see it's a beach. There's lots of people running around, but for a few weeks of the year, this is actually a nesting site with the bees going up into the beach peas or whatever flowers are around there, and then taking the pollen back to their babies underground. So these sites are very important, where the bee is very connected to the flower. And in some cases, that relationship is so specific. If you lose the bee, you lose the flower. If you lose the flower, you lose the bee. So this is, we call these Habropoda bees digger bees. And bees have Latin names, but they also have common names. And so this is called, as I said, the Pacific June digger bee, but it's also the silver digger bee because it's got those beautiful silvery hairs. And bees are different from wasps in that bees have branched hairs, which are evolved for collecting the pollen that they feed to their babies, which are larvae. So they have an interesting life cycle. The males emerge first from the ground and they look for females, wait for them to emerge. And so the females emerge and then the males just pounce on them and mate with them. And the strongest males are the ones that get to mate with the females. And females dig 20 to 30 inches into the sand to lay one egg. That's a heck of a lot of work for one solitary single mom. I was listening to a wonderful talk today by Leif Richardson of the Xerxes Society about ground nesting bees. I don't know if you caught that. It was fantastic. And he was saying that ground nesters they can go a couple centimeters deep or they can go up to 5 meters deep. There is an Andrina mining bee in Italy that makes a nest 5 meters deep. I mean, that's just mind-blowing. And I've always wondered about nesting in the sand, like how do they keep the nest from collapsing? So bees have evolved secretions to line these nests to keep them in the integrity of the structure. And they also use things like resins. And so they have this ecological niche where whatever kind of substrate that they nest in, they have tools evolved to help them either keep it wet or keep it dry, depending on the needs of the site and the needs of the bee. So solitary bees are above ground. Leif was saying it can be as short as 2 weeks above the ground, in the ground. And the rest of the time they're below the ground, developing from an egg to a larva to a pupa to an adult. So that stage that we see, this bee season, can be very short for certain solitary bees. And the research on this particular bee was by Leslie Saul Gershens. It takes a special kind of person to study ground nesting bees, because imagine that Italian scientist who had to dig 5 meters to find the bottom of that nest of the Andrina bee. It takes a lot of patience, and I can imagine just a kind of zealousness. So there's 20,000 species of bees approximately worldwide. Only about 9 of them make honey. We've got over 900 species in Canada, nearly 500 in BC. So we're the province that has the most species of bees. Yeah, we do. But when you're talking about North America and Hawaii, there's 4,000 species. So the further south you go, the more species there are, the more biodiversity there is. So honeybees are not native to Canada. People often think about bees as the honeybees as bees. Bees are honeybees. And they think that the honeybees need saving. They don't. The honeybees are fine. They get shipped all over the world. They're taking over. They're fine. In fact, Leif today had the gall to call them an invasive species, which I thought was very interesting. Relying on one species of bee, i.e. the European honeybee Apis mellifera, to pollinate our food systems is a high strategy and a high risk strategy, and it could contribute to the loss of native bees. So that's something that we all need to think about. That's the dark side of the inconvenient truth about honeybees. And today, Leif was saying that one honeybee hive in a year takes food away from 100,000 solitary bee larvae. So yes, there is competition. There's direct competition between honeybees and native bees. I always love to show this picture by Ty Rolston because it's a circle of biodiversity, from the really giant, big, furry Xylocopa bees, the carpenter bees, the bumblebees, to the medium-sized blue orchard bees, honeybees, to the really, really, really tiny, tiny bees. The smallest bee is called Perdita, and Perdita is so tiny. Sometimes they're called shadow bees, sometimes they're called fairy bees, because you kind of have to be away with the fairies to see them. And Perdita means lost in Spanish. So it's very poetic. And I really like this pollinator partnership bookmark because it kind of shows you the gestalt of a lot of the bees, the shapes, the shadows. When birders are looking at birds, they often look at the gestalt of the bird. It's the same thing with bees. You can see some of them are more squat and some of them are very, graceful and more linear looking. So this is one way of sort of studying bees and looking at their gestalt. There's lots of threats to native bees: loss of habitat, pesticides. I say all the sides: fungicides, miticides, all those sides are bad for bees. Pathogens, spillover from domesticated bees. This is another issue. It's not just direct food competition, but honeybees actually spread diseases to native bees. There's competition for forage and nesting sites from introduced bees. And honeybees are not the only introduced bees. There can be other invasive species of bees. Grazing and overgrazing, we should call it. Sometimes when cattle are used on the prairies, I often think that, God, if they weren't there, they'd be digging up that land and farming it and actually losing the grassland altogether. So if you don't overgraze the land, you can preserve some of the natural prairie, but it often ends up overgrazed. Fire. Too much fire at one time is bad for bees. If there's patches of fire, managed patches of fire, then you can save some of the bees in habitat and you can cycle it out so that the losses aren't so great the way it would have happened naturally or with indigenous management. Loss of genetic variety is hard on native bees. Climate change, differences in temperature, and again, affecting which plants are going to be available, how much nectar they're going to produce, all that affects native bees. And then when more than one of these things occurs together, there's a negative. Populations can crash very quickly, especially with development and cultivation. So this is Link's slide, and it's Lincoln Best's slide. And he is our most treasured taxonomist in the Native Bee Society of British Columbia. He has spent many years studying the native bees of BC, and he knows so much. He just contains so much knowledge and wisdom. And so this shows you a breakdown of the species. And the highest bee diversity is actually in the southern interior, where there's different ecosystems that all come together. And so that's a really exciting place to go and see bees. And I was there this summer in bee school, and it was quite thrilling. So we at the Native Bee Society have started a project, and it's the NBS BC Bee Tracker. It's on iNaturalist. So if you take a picture of a bee in BC, it will show up here, and I will try to identify it. My colleagues will try to identify it. I will try to match it to the flower that it's going to. And we're collecting that data. So that's one way that we're studying native bees of British Columbia. We'd love you to take part in that project. So out of that information, I made up this card for some of the most common native bees of BC, which will be there in Surrey. The only one you won't see in Surrey is the third one at the top. That is Agapostum invarescens, which you'll actually see in the interior, but not in the lower mainland. But I really like it, so I had to put it in there. But some of these bees are more common. A lot of them are bumblebees. Yeah, I know. But some of them are solitary bees as well. On the back of the card, and we'll put this on our website for the Native Bee Society, it actually has the names of the bees so that you can look them up. So in the spring, in Nanaimo, it was really cold one day. Darren and I were out looking for bees, and this was the first bee that I saw of the year, very close to the first day of spring, hanging on to a pussy willow for her dear life because it was really, really cold. So this is Bombus melanopygus, and the social bees, bumblebees, are some of the first ones out because they're big and hairy, and they can actually thermoregulate, and so they can go out in colder temperatures. So they're very Canadian bees. And there are other insects also that are really important to willows, and willows are important to them. Oh, sorry. There's the Lorquin's Western tiger swallowtail, Lorquin's admiral. The caterpillars need the willows. And there's also spring mining bees, honeybees, and bumblebees that are all really depend on the nectar and pollen from those early plants. This is another plant that has an ethnobotanical importance, and this is evergreen huckleberry, Vaccinium ovatum. The Makah people used to maintain the bushes by pruning and burning them, so that meant more flowers, which is better for the bees, and more berries, which is better for the bears and the humans. So this is another way of I'm acknowledging a kind of land acknowledgement of the connection between First Nations plants and bees. And here we have Bombus melanopygus collecting a huge wad of pollen from the evergreen huckleberry flowers. And this is the same species, Bombus melanopygus, in the bog blueberries in Camosun Bog in Vancouver. And here is a cultivated blueberry. So BC imports 20,000 hives from Alberta every year for blueberry pollination. That's Apis mellifera honeybee hives. But honeybees did not evolve with blueberries, and they don't get enough protein from them. They also do not have the capacity to buzz pollinate the stamens to get the most pollen out of them. So they're not the best pollinators for blueberries. And they often come back failing and not doing really well after pollinating blueberry fields. So the beekeepers don't like to put them on blueberries. So that's a crop where we really need our native bees. And there's many species of native bees that are actually better at pollinating blueberries than honey bees. So that's just one example that I wanted to tell you about how important our native bees are to our food crops. So this is the solitary bee life cycle, and I'm taking the Master Melittologist course, which began in Oregon, but we have one in BC. This is one of their illustrations, which I really like, and it shows the solitary bee life cycle. So solitary bees either live in cavities or in the ground. They're either excavators or renters. And the female bee basically needs a chamber or cell where she can lay an egg. And before she does that, she needs a ball of pollen or a soupy kind of little mix of pollen porridge that she can lay her egg in. So she has to find the site or make the site. Then she brings the pollen into the site, lays the egg, and then there's a wall that she creates to protect that cell. And it can be made from mud or plant material or pebbles or clay or a mix of different things. It can also be made from sawdust, from the twig that she's in. So she lays the eggs up, she gives them enough pollen to get into adulthood, and then she leaves. And so the eggs hatch, the bees emerge, they mate, and then the cycle starts all over again. So sometimes one of the stages includes making a cocoon to protect the prepupal state, and sometimes it doesn't. Here's an example of a bee that lays an egg in a twig, and they are excavators. They're small carpenter bees. And so the way I recognize them when I see them in a photo is they have a butt like a Hershey's Kiss. They're tiny, shiny little bees. And what's interesting about solitary bees is sometimes they're not completely solitary. They have a little bit of a sociality to them. And with carpenter bees, the dwarf eldest daughter stays back at the nest and helps look after it. So that's a really interesting quirk of these solitary bees. And here we have my photographs of them. And this is a couple that are mating. And you can see the twig in this salal bush, which has been broken. And that's where the bee is going down and making her nest. So when you are making a pollinator garden, one of the things to think about is to leave a kind of a stubble cut from your perennials. So this is a really good example of a boulevard garden. They've got rid of the lawn, yay, and they've planted these amazing plants. And then in the fall, this time of the year, they just give it a really nice round stubble cut so that there are twigs that the bees can lay their eggs in. And that is the best thing to do. So at this time of the year, again, you're starting to hear things like leave the leaves, leave the twigs in your stubble cut, and also let your garden sleep in the fall. In the spring, don't tidy it up because there's going to be bees emerging from your garden. So it's actually better to let the birds eat the seeds and leave those twigs, leave those leaves, leave your garden a bit messy, so that the bees can pupate and then they can come out next bee season. Here's an example of ground nesting bees. This is Halictus rubicundus. This is at a high school, believe it or not, like a raked piece of ground, 45-degree angle. It's one of the places on the high school grounds that nobody really goes. It's this little beautiful bee oasis that happens to be there. And I've taken many, many photographs of bees there. And here she is landing on the ground, and that pollen is actually dandelion pollen. It's bright orange, it's like cheesy dust. And then she goes in, deep, deep, and she disappears into the ground. So that happens for a few weeks of the year while the bees are active. And then for the rest of the year, you don't see anything. So I showed the students in biology class, the bees and then the dandelions and where they were going back and forth. And then the next day I went to show another class, and the gardeners had mowed the dandelions. And it was like, that connection is just not being made with the gardeners. And there was no reason to mow the dandelions. They were not bothering anyone. So it's one of those things where the education really has to come into it. Dandelions aren't the best food for bees, but sometimes they're the only food for bees, right? So sometimes around ground nests, you'll see this little tumulus of soil. It's kind of like a miniature Bugs Bunny nest. And that is the soil that was just displaced when they were making the nest. And then as you see in these cutaway shots, there's one nest entrance that has different cells that go off. And it can be more or less complex depending on the kind of bee. And sometimes, again, bees will share the same nest. And sometimes it's just single mom, single nest. And that's what the egg looks like on the pollen bowl. And this summer, I was able to go to Victoria. I was an artist in residence at the in Victoria, and I got to see this interesting cliff nesting bee that nests in this really hard packed soil at the beach. And it is an Anthophora bee, Anthophora bomboides, called this because it looks like a bumblebee. And they build a little chimney around the entrance of their nest. It's actually very charming. And here you see all these little chimneys all together in an aggregate. And there is one making its nest. Apparently they go get water and they squirt it out of their butt. And that's what they use as the kind of spackling around the entrance. Camas, again, a wonderful plant that is used by First Nations for food. And they have a festival at Cattle Point in Victoria, and it's a fantastic native bee plant. There's like 100 species of native bees that go on to Camas. And one of them is the blue orchard bee, the bob, which actually is a very good pollinator of cherry trees and fruit trees in the spring. This is the hairy belly bee. It actually collects pollen on its belly. So you can see the bee is rubbing its belly against those stamens. And that's the pollen that it's going to take back to its nest. And these are cavity nesting bees that nest in beetle holes in trees and sometimes in twigs as well. Mostly in tree trunks. And here you can see the behavior of the bee drinking nectar from the center of the flower. And here you can see the bee gathering pollen. So this floral resource has both nectar and pollen for bees. So this, I talked a little bit about diet breadth. When a specialist bee is called oligolectic, when the pollen is sourced from a single plant or plant family. And polylecty is when it's a generalist bee that sources pollen from many families of plants. And this summer, with Darren, I was able to see the death camas bee. Now, death camas is a toxic plant. The pollen and nectar are toxic, and so there's one species of bee that can tolerate that. And this is the death camas bee. It's a beautiful Andrena bee, nests in the ground with these smoky wingtips. And in this photo, it's kind of funny. You can actually see a male that's making a beeline towards the female on the flower. So what's interesting, so this is the only bee that can drink this death camas nectar. And this was found a while back. And the bee itself is called Andrena astragali. And then what's interesting too is that bees often have parasites called cuckoo bees that lay their eggs in the nest and try to take over the nested bee. But the parasites that try to do that with the death camas bee get poisoned from the pollen provisions. And so they don't have a cuckoo bee. And when I found that out, I was just flabbergasted. That's just amazing. So this is another sighting of the death camas bee, and this was on Galliano Island. And so the great thing about the INAT bee tracker plant is I can go back and I can see, oh, my friend Andrew actually saw one on Galliano Island. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about this bee course that I mentioned. If you really wanted to get into bees, you can take a master melittologist course. And this is a bee school course, where another way of getting to know bees. And this was in the Okanagan. We went into this place in the Okanagan where there's a lot of snowberry, common snowberry, and there's a bee that specializes in it. And they were making nests all along the road, right by the snowberry. And then there's a specialist parasite of that bee, which is the Neolara bee. That's what this is. So this is another bee that will go on common snowberry. Snowberry is a fantastic plant for many different kinds of bees, even though it does have a specialist bee. So this is where bumblebees can get in there and they can source nectar from the plant for many weeks. It actually blooms for months. So it's a really good bee plant, and it's a native plant. And this is another mining bee, an Andrena mining bee that sources nectar from this plant. So I was lucky to participate in another artist residency at the McLaughlin Gardens at the Comox Valley Art Gallery. And here you can see a cyanotype print I made, or a sun print, of the snowberry flower. So all the bee plants that were around there, I was able to make cyanotypes from them. And that was a really wonderful thing to do, to get that botanical imprint. So now I'm going to just talk about some really cool solitary bees in the grasslands, because the video talked a lot about grassland bees. And so this is in Spence's Bridge, BC, and this is a leafcutter bee. And I don't know if you can see it, but under her wing, there's actually a tiny little crab spider on the right side center, which is when it gets bigger, it will be attacking bees. It's actually a predator of bees, but right now it's just watching the action. And there you can see the side of the leafcutter bee. And she's got really nice dark wings and this hair under her belly where she collects the pollen. And this is actually gumweed. And gumweed is a fantastic bee plant. We have one on the coast, which is Oregon gumweed. And then in the prairies and in the grasslands, it's curly cup gumweed. It's a different variety, but there's lots of it in Saskatchewan and Alberta. And here you can see actually the bracts are really curly from the plant, and that's where it gets its name. And in terms of scent, I find that the scent of this plant is almost like a kind of a resiny, chocolatey smell. And when there's a lot of it together and it's a warm day, you can smell it, and it's just delicious. So here we have more leafcutter bees, and this is what the males look like. And the males are really cute because they're very possessive of the plants and of the females, and they will hip check other bees out of the flowers. So they just hover and they attack. They also have these very furry forelegs, which are called sex mittens, because they put them over the female bee's eyes so that they don't fly away while they're mating. So they're very adorable. And they have cute butts. So these bees have cuckoo bees that lay eggs in their nests. They're called Coleoxys bees or sharp-tailed bees because they often have very pointy tails. And there you go. And so the reason they have pointy tails is that they can be combative and they might fight other bees to get into their nests. There's another bee that goes onto the gumweed. They're called cellophane bees because they line their ground nests with a kind of cellophane. I call them, they sometimes get called polyester bees. So I call them that 70s bee because they use polyester. So this is the dark form, we think, of a very cool Melisodes bee that might be called Melisodes bimatris. we can't always tell species from photographs, and so sometimes it's a little bit tricky, but you can see it's got a beautiful dark abdomen and these striking blue eyes. This is another Melissodes with those really shaggy pollen pads, and they're called longhorned bees. So this is a female longhorned bees, and they also nest in the ground. This is Melissodes microsticta. I call it the tabby cat bee because it kind of has the tabby cat colors. Lots of pollen on the outer back legs. And the males have really long antennae, which is why they're called longhorned bees. There's sweat bees that will actually land on you and lick your sweat. They nest in the ground. They're very sweet. And here we have competition between these beautiful native bees. Some bees are really, really tiny and shiny, and these sweat bees are called Dianthidium. You can actually see the resin in the middle of that plant, but there's pollen and nectar as well. So we also saw clouded sulfur butterflies on these flowers. Then we saw a plant that I fall in love with this year, which is called rabbit brush, which grows in the grasslands up in the Okanagan and the Caribou. So we got to see what the plant looks like when it's going to seed, and we got to see some of the seeds and the bees, the chonker Melissodes bees with these big, big, big pollen pads. They're just incredible. And we saw that dark Melissodes again. Is it Melissodes bimatris? It's a bit of a mystery. And so my partner Darren saw them in Penticton. And so Darren has actually collected a specimen, and we're going to look at it under the microscope to see if we can confirm that it is indeed Melissodes bimatris. My friend Lisa, who lives in Washington, has also found one, and she was the one that keyed us on to what species it might be. So it's a bit of a mystery. We work together and we're nerding out on this bee and trying to figure out what it is. It's really a lot of fun. Honestly, it is. Here's another one of these sleepy leafcutter boys, so cute with the furry sex mittens. And another bee I saw up there in the Caribou was an Andrena, and it was identified by John Asher as, the earless mining bee, which I'd never seen before. So this is a new species for me for this year as well, another Andrena. And it has been seen before in Kamloops on rabbit brush and up in Williams Lake on what looks like gumweed. So it's really interesting to see what it's been seen on in other places. And this is a cultivated Joe Pye weed that it's been seen on as well. This is actually in Alberta. Sorry, am I going over time?
Yes, just
Okay.
wanted to leave
I'll just wrap it
some
up.
time for the Q&A session.
Yeah, here is some Alberta bees. And I wanted to say that it's a good idea. And when you go to birding areas, IBAs, important bird areas, to have bee forage as well, because a lot of plants that are good for birds, like wild sunflowers, they eat the seeds, are also great for bees. So this is one of those leafcutter boys in Frank Lake. And this is Bombus occidentalis, which is actually used to be the most common bumblebee in Western Canada and is now becoming increasingly rare. And this is one that I saw also at this area near Calgary and in Sandy Cross. So what can I do? You need to garden for biodiversity, beauty, and resilience. Becoming a better naturalist can make you a better bee gardener. Become a community scientist, help us with these projects. Volunteer for bee research. As a citizen scientist, you can actually work with professionals and collect data. And design your own pollinator garden, lose the lawn. Start building a community around these things so that we can switch the paradigm away from lawns. We need to map gardens and connect them. Connectivity creates pollinator corridors. And work with birders, as I said, work with people who are advocates for butterflies, because they also understand why we do things like leave the leaves. And join the Native Bee Society of British Columbia and find my book in the library. It's out of print. I also recommend this book for people who are in Alberta. This is Native Plants for the Short Season Yard by Lyndon Penner. He's an awesome gardener. He knows a lot about native plants in the prairies. And have fun. That's my big message. Okay, sorry I went so long.
You so much, Lori. It's yeah, so great to see there's still so many different varieties of bee species out there, and yeah, so many different characters. And if you are interested in identifying more bee species, I believe the BC Native Society is doing regular meetings. And yeah, feel free to join if when's the next session, if I may ask?
It's coming up pretty soon. I think it's next week. So check in on our events page and you can lurk or you can bring your own photos of bees. Even if you're not from BC, you can come on in and join in the fun, and it's really it's a good time.
Great. And yeah, now I want to open up for any questions from our participants. I think we can now unmute if you want to join in. We had a couple questions in the chat section. I think there was one from Aquil, if I'm saying it right. Question for Alana and Bryce. Thanks for the screening of the film, and I'm noticing little to no humans in the film. The language subtitles of text were maybe the most human element. I'm assuming this was intentional. If there's anything you want to expand on that.
Oh, sure. Yeah, it was definitely it's intentional. Like when we were filming, we really weren't seeing many people in a lot of landscapes we were in, and we wanted to kind of focus on kind of like the impacts that humans have on the landscape, and the different ways that the bee would experience it. And so I guess we didn't like talk about that choice specifically of not having humans in it, but I think in like trying to decenter the human perspective, we just kind of followed a storyline that yeah, didn't have any people on the landscape.
Yeah, it was just there could have been maybe if we wanted to have an odd hiker or someone in the background, but it's kind of more about what the bee was probably hypothetically focusing on than what we might be focusing on as humans walking through the landscape. So.
Yeah, and I think just like the idea that there's so many human impact on the landscape, but then like in a lot of these rural areas, we just weren't seeing anyone else. So we were seeing some animal life and lots of plant life and bees, but no humans. Yeah, and then bringing the language element too. We were trying to kind of get into the bees head, I guess, a little bit.
Animated head voice.
Yeah. And kind of be a bit playful with it, and not worry too much about the conventions of language, even though
especially not worry too much about it, just enough to get the idea of the feeling across. But we kind of tossed the idea back and forth that a bee wouldn't really have respect for the English language, so that we didn't have to have respect for the English language writing what a bee was thinking hypothetically.
like would it capitalize things, for
Yeah,
example.
no.
But and it was very much like we wanted to kind of have it and feel like fragmented a little bit, like the way that you remember a dream or have a memory, and kind of have a poetic feel to it too, and also keep a little bit of the humor in there.
Yeah.
I was also curious how you kind of made that connection to what, like, how did you kind of make the connection to how the bee might be perceiving the surrounding, since it's such like a micro kind of perspective. And a lot of the narration, I just loved reading the caption, because it really, for me, that was like a really strong kind of connection to like build that connection and then like to think as a bee. And then of course it's like imaginary and fiction, and it's coming from you both. And I'm curious, like how was it like to like step into the world of a bee for a second?
I feel like a lot of that develops naturally when we were editing the film, more so than when we were filming and doing pre-production.
Yeah.
And that when we were putting all the scenes together, it's kind of, we started writing the dialogue, and it was kind of like started as our commentary to our scenes and what we thought this character was about, and kind of morphed from there, or evolved from there.
Yeah, I think like with filmmaking too, I think a lot about storytelling and different ways of telling stories with experimental film, and kind of, I mean, there's like a linearity to film, but then how do you kind of like disrupt that a little bit in different ways? And so that was part of it too. And I think about that a lot in the editing process, because you're kind of going back and forth and you know, taking bits of footage and constructing the narrative and really building it. And so I think like Bryce said, as that developed, it's like we had that experience of being on location and filming, and I was the one kind of animating the bee. So I felt like I was trying to become bee-like in this odd way, where it was, you know, working with these very small implements and getting very close to these flowers and really trying to understand them. And just, yeah, even looking through the camera, it gives you such a different perspective of these plants and what it might feel like to kind of really be immersed in them and be drawn to them, and have a different type of relationship with them than, you know, just standing in the landscape and looking down. Like even that photo you showed, Lori, of like the plants on the beach, like the close up versus, you know, what that looked like when, if you just like walking down the beach, it's just so drastically different. So I feel like just that process of filming really, for me, in the ways that like got me in this kind of headspace of, you know, trying to look at the things that we don't take the time to notice, or we kind of, yeah, pass by, and paying attention to our surroundings and the overlooked things and the small things, and to appreciate insects in a different way.
And after working on this film for about 2 years and writing the dialogue right at the end of it, all that information is inside of us and percolating around. It kind of didn't take too much once we sat down to do it to make that part.
Yeah, because I think for me, a lot of my work, I can't even make it unless I go outside. And like I always talk about, my studio is always at home, because I feel like a lot of my work, even in a studio, it's always outside, and I need to kind of visit sites in order to have these experiences that really then inform the work. And so I think all that experiential kind of knowledge and learning, and that just comes out in different ways when I'm back in the studio, kind of making and having conversations that inform the work.
That's great. Thank you. Does anyone else has any questions?
I have a question. Hang on. Hi, Alana and Bryce. Thanks for showing your work, and Lori, thanks for the informative slideshow. I was really curious. I'm sorry if I missed it, but I'm curious if about the sound design. If I don't recall you talking about it, but I was curious if that was something you outsourced, if that was you worked on yourself, what that process was like. Sometimes, like, I could definitely hear that or feel like the dream kind of scape of it, but sometimes it's also very like 80s sci-fi, like almost like a Star Trek sound.
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah, if you
Yeah.
could speak to that, would be great. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for that question.
Yeah.
We didn't talk about this at all, realizing.
And it was such a great process to work on.
Yeah, the sound was really tricky for us. Like, I think we didn't have, I think we were, yeah, we got so focused on the scent component and the visual. And then when we went to do the sound, we're like, wait, what does this sound like? And it's a lot of free sound actually, and then recorded sounds. So we were recording sound when we were out filming. But then we had realized we wanted to make it sound kind of wacky, and we like that kind of otherworldly thing, almost like alien-like with the bee and the flowers.
It built on the humor.
Yeah,
aspect.
and building on the humor. Started looking for kind of sound effects that we could just kind of put together.
Based off of verbal descriptions of what we thought the scene kind of sounded like,
Yeah,
and then weeded through those. We also did
We-
some
we made a
post
lot of
production,
stuff.
like the sound of me sucking is one of the, when the bee is sucking the food out of the flower and you hear this like obsessant sound.
yeah,
We did a lot of recording of that to figure that out,
Yeah.
basically.
recording of the cows moving and kind of wind, and so there's actually a lot of like the sound was pretty complex, and I had a lot of fun putting it together because I really like sound design, and even though I'm pretty novice at it, but I would say, yeah, it was, we wanted to make it have almost like a weird sci-fi feel, and that with two different video pieces. Yeah, we wanted it to be kind of like wacky and fun.
Comes from
Yeah.
other genres we've worked on, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, I really like, I don't know, just using sound effects and synthesizers and use theremins in my work as well.
Yeah.
Not in this one, but yeah.
Alternative instruments.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's,
I
Yeah.
can tell you had a lot of fun acting out the sounds, because every time I hear it, I start to like have a smile too. Thanks so much for that question. Yeah, I think we're now a little bit over time, and if there's no more question, I think we can close the event tonight. Thanks so much for everyone that's participating, and also to Alana and Bryce and Lori. Such amazing talk, and yeah, and I hope people can come by the gallery. The exhibition closed on December 4th. And if you can make it to the gallery, please feel free to let us know if you would like to receive a scratch and sniff card through mail as well. Have a good evening.
Yeah.
Right.